Episode 25, Superstar Investor and Human Rights Activist Bill Browder. Welcome to The Art of Excellence, a show about people doing extraordinary things in their lives. I'm your host, Glenn Zweig. Thanks for joining me. My guest today is Bill Browder. Bill is the founder and CEO of Hermitage Capital, which was the largest investor in Russia and one of the highest performing investors in the world for a number of years. More recently, he has been spearheading a campaign to expose Russia's corruption and human rights abuses. His efforts led to the passing of the Magnitsky Act of 2012. He's the author of Red Notice, a true story of high finance, murder, and one man's fight for justice. Bill, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
Wonderful. Both your father and brother were these child prodigies, earning their PhDs before most people even finished college, and spent their entire lives in academia. Then you come along and you get kicked out of boarding school, which is a little strange. So what's the backstory there?
Well, so I come from a family of communists and a family of geniuses, and I was neither a communist or a genius. And so when I was going through my teenage rebellion, I tried to figure out the best way that I could rebel from this family. And my rebellion was to put on a suit and tie and become a capitalist. And that was the beginning of my big adventure in business and my adventure in Russia.
Was there something behind this rebellious nature of yours?
If you grew up in a family like mine where if you're not a child prodigy, that you're stupid, it creates it created a strong incentive to sort of to find my own way outside of academia. And I guess I kind of had a chip on my shoulder from a very early age to try to prove myself in some area other than academia.
So they had set the bar so high, I guess, that you felt like there's no way I can possibly live up to those expectations. I'll take a different course, that type of thing.
Indeed. So just to put this into some clear perspective, my father went to MIT at the age of 14 and graduated by 17, had his PhD from Princeton at the time he was 21. And my brother skipped high school, went to the University of Chicago at the age of 15 and graduated when he was 18, Phi Beta Kappa in physics. And so I definitely couldn't compete with them, and so I needed to carve my own path.
Well, indeed you did. You obviously eventually got your act together, graduated from University of Chicago and then Stanford Business School. But instead of following the tried and true corporate career paths, you decided that you wanted to do work in Russia. So why Russia of all places? What was the attraction?
My grandfather was the leader of the Communist Party of America in the 1930s and 1940s, and that his communism was a big part of our family culture. And as I was trying to figure out what to do with myself in life, I was at Stanford Business School and graduating in 1989, which was the year that the Berlin Wall came down. As I was looking at career opportunities, most of the standard career opportunities being offered on campus didn't interest me. But I had this epiphany one day, which was that if my grandfather was the biggest communist in America and the Berlin Wall has just come down, I'm going to set out to become the biggest capitalist in Eastern Europe. And that's what I set out to do.
But of course, this was before, or maybe at the very onset of the privatization in Russia. So it was just sort of a hunch you were going on?
This is one of these examples of how one can be successful in life. If you have a reason to do something which is not profit oriented, but you find yourself focusing on an area that eventually becomes profitable, by being there early, you tend to gain huge advantages. So, for example, I'm sure that Bill Gates, when he was interested in software, it wasn't a big industry. And similarly, Mark Andreessen, when he started Netscape, the idea that of going to Russia before it was profitable, before any business people were there. I was there for personal reasons, not for profit reasons, but I had a couple-year head start over everybody else who came rushing in later on.
So after doing some consulting work, you landed at Salomon Brothers, a very prestigious investment bank at the time. Talk about the first big Russia assignment that you did for them.
Well, my very first assignment was to advise the management of the Murmansk trawler fleet, which is a fishing fleet located a couple hundred miles north of the Arctic Circle in Murmansk, on their privatization. So I go to Murmansk. I'm met at the airport by the head of the fishing fleet. He takes me down to the dock so I could see one of their ships. And when I got there, I was amazed at how enormous this vessel was. It was about 300 feet long. It was on a number of different stories. The top story, they caught the fish in nets. The next story, they separated the fish. And then further down below, they actually had machines on board that canned the fish. And it was all very impressive. And I asked him, how much does one of these things cost? He said they cost about $20 million new. And then I asked him, how many of these ships do you have in your fleet? And he said, there's 100 of them. And so I did the math. 20 million times 100 is 2 billion. I asked him the age of the fleet, and he said the fleet is roughly 7 years old. And so back of the envelope, I said it's probably half depreciated, $1 billion worth of ships. And I'd been hired by this management team to determine or to advise on whether they should exercise their legitimate right under the privatization program to buy 51% of the company. And I asked him, at what price is the government selling 51% of the company? And he said $2.5 million. So remember, there's $1 billion worth of ships, and the management has hired me to advise them on whether to purchase 51% of this company for $2.5 million. You don't have to be a Stanford MBA to know the answer to that question, which is, of course, it's the most obvious thing in the world. And of course, that's what I advised them. But that's what got me thinking very seriously that there's something big going on in Russia, and it's probably far beyond this fishing fleet, and I want to get involved.
Pretty insane to think about how incorrectly priced these assets were at the time. Just to fast forward the story a little bit, you end up getting some allocation of capital from the investment bank to go off and start investing on the firm's behalf. And you have a lot of success. You're making a lot of money for Salomon Brothers, and they seem to be happy. But at some point, you said, time to take off and do my own thing and raise my own fund. So I guess I'm curious, what was the impetus to leave the bank? Because I'm assuming you can make pretty good money at the investment bank, but you really wanted to go do this on your own. Why?
Well, the main impetus was that it wasn't about money at all. After I had made a bunch of money for Salomon Brothers, we made five times our capital in a year, 500% return in our first year investing in Russia. And people started to hear about me, the sort of great and good of people on Wall Street. And so I started getting these invitations to come and brief famous investors like George Soros and Michael Steinhardt and Julian Robertson, who were what I describe as the royalty of Wall Street. And each one of these people, when I went to them, I said to them, I showed them the economics of investing in Russian stocks, and they all were amazed and wanting to get involved. And they all asked me, can we give you some money to manage? And I said, I'm not sure. Let me go back to the bosses and see what they say. And so I went back to the bosses, and I said, I've got all these people including George Soros, that want us to manage their money. What do you think? And the big boss at the time said, I think that's a genius idea. Let's form a task force to study it. So I show up at the first task force meeting, and there's 45 people there. 40 of them I've never seen before in my life. There was the vice chairman of the firm, senior managing directors, senior directors, senior vice presidents, and then me. I was the lowest guy in the totem pole. And as soon as the meeting started, there was this fight that broke out between all these bankers about who should get the economic credit for the business. And these people were highly articulate about why they deserved money that they hadn't earned in some way. It was like watching a game of multi-dimensional tennis, as each of them sort of lobbed in their arguments about why they deserved the money from the business, the economic credit for the business. And I had no idea who was going to win this argument, but I was absolutely 100% sure who wasn't going to get any economic credit for the business, and that was going to be me. And again, it wasn't really so much about money as just about the fact that all these people were sort of piling in, trying to sort of steal my idea. And so I decided that I was going to go do this on my own, and I left Salomon Brothers in April of 1996 to start the Hermitage Fund and move to Russia.
So before we get into the Hermitage Fund and all the success you had there and the crazy roller coaster ride, looking back, why do you suppose you were such an anomaly investing in Russia at this time? I mean, it was one of the biggest countries in the world, with an entire economy about to be privatized. Why weren't there thousands of other investors like you all over this opportunity?
I was there for strange family reasons because of my grandfather, but the reality is that almost everybody else in the world looked at Russia and they said, well, this is the evil empire. This is the country, the Cold War, our Cold War enemy. And then to the extent that people got any closer to Russia to look at it more properly, they were saying, well, there's no stock exchange. There's no all the things that you normally take for granted in the West didn't exist there. And so everybody pretty much shrugged their shoulders and said, I don't know, it looks too complicated. I don't want to get involved. And because I was already there and I was sort of, learning my way, it was like it's kind of like the gold rush in the Wild West. I was just sort of prospecting out there. But because I was already out there and I was sort of putting one foot in front of the other, all the uncertainties that most people thought should dissuade them from investing, none of those affected me in the same way. And so I was one of literally one handful of people from the West that was out there at the time.
Well, you start this fund and pretty quickly the value of your holdings went up, I think tenfold, almost overnight. And at one point, you were considered, I think, one of the greatest, maybe the highest performing investor in the world. And then all of a sudden, the fund loses a good percentage of its value almost as quickly as it took you to build it up. And you're sort of back to where you started, maybe even underwater. So what happened?
The rise was basically, we invested before the presidential election of 1996, which happened in July of 1996. The situation was that you had a communist, his name was Gennady Zyuganov, who was running against a capitalist whose name was Boris Yeltsin. And the communist, Zyuganov, basically told the world that if he gets elected president, he was going to renationalize all of the assets. In other words, that if you own shares of a company, after he's elected, they were going to get taken away from you. Now, the capitalist, Boris Yeltsin, said, well, if I get elected, you'll get to keep your assets. And so we made a very bold bet going into the presidential elections of 1996 that Boris Yeltsin would be elected and not the communist. And sure enough, our bet was correct. And as a result, as you said, we made nearly 10 times our money. We made 865% over a 18-month period. And that was all great and good. But then what happened was in 1998, and many people won't remember this because it's so long ago, but in 1998, Russia had a big economic problem. The bonds, their domestic bonds defaulted. They devalued their currency by 75%. And my portfolio, which at the time before going into this economic crisis was worth $1 billion, my portfolio went down 90%. We lost $900 million. And so as easy as we made it, we gave it back very, very quickly. But when that happened, it created another set of issues because the oligarchs, who were the majority shareholders of the companies I was investing in, and the oligarchs, just for you and your listeners, are these sharp-elbowed rich guys. 22 of them ended up effectively seizing 40% of the economy in Russia. And the oligarchs who owned these companies I was investing in decided that since basically the Western capital markets were closed after the economic collapse, there was no longer any incentive for them to behave themselves. Instead, they could cheat and steal. It would have no consequence to them in terms of future business. And so the oligarchs, after the economic collapse of 1998, in 1999, embarked on an orgy of stealing, which has been unprecedented in the history of business. They were doing asset stripping, transfer pricing, embezzlements, dilution, and they were doing it to a high art. And as a result of that, I had to become a anti-corruption activist in order to protect my investments in Russia.
And explain what you mean by that. What does being an activist investor mean at that point in time? What are you doing to affect your holdings?
Well, probably the best example of what I was doing involved a company in Russia called Gazprom. Gazprom, for most people know Gazprom, is the largest gas company in Russia. And in fact, it's the largest gas company in the world. They hold the reserves for 35% of the world's natural gas. And at the time, in 1999, Gazprom traded at a 99.7% discount to the value of Exxon or British Petroleum per barrel of hydrocarbon reserves. Basically, it was trading almost for free. And the reason why it was so cheap was that everybody who was in the market was assuming that every last cubic meter of gas reserves had been somehow transferred off the balance sheet of the company. And so we decided to do what I call a stealing analysis of Gazprom to figure out what had been stolen. And we went through this very long and arduous analytical process, and we came to the very clear and documented conclusion that oil and gas reserves the size of Kuwait had been stolen off the balance sheet of Gazprom. That was the first conclusion we came to. But the second conclusion we came to was that oil and gas reserves the size of Kuwait only represented 9.65% of Gazprom's total reserves, which meant that the market was completely and absolutely wrong. The market thought that 99.7% of the assets had been stolen, and we've just proven that more than 90% of the assets have not been stolen. Now, when you find an anomaly like that in the financial markets, that's like gold dust. And we decided to buy as much Gazprom stock as we could. Once we finished buying the Gazprom stock, it became my single largest investment. And at that point, I decided to take the information that we had learned, put it into a dossier, and break the dossier into 7 chapters, and share the first chapter with the Financial Times, second chapter with the New York Times, third chapter with Business Week, fourth chapter with the Washington Post.
Hang on, just for some context here. Because if no one else knows what you've done, then who cares, right? The only way to affect the price once you've made this incredible discovery is if, the market's correct because the public knows about it and then the investors all pile on, right? So that's why you need to now go through a campaign.
Exactly. Now normally as a public market investor, you figure out the anomaly, you prove it to yourself, you take your position, and then you wait for the market to figure it out. But I decided that I was going to be more proactive than that. I was too impatient to wait. And that's why I decided to share this information with all of the different international media. So I shared it with all these different newspapers. They wrote stories about the theft and graft of management at Gazprom. Their stories then were followed by stories from the Russian press who picked up the story. As a result of those stories, the Russian parliament, the State Duma, began debates about whether it was a good thing or a bad thing for these assets to be stolen. After that, the management of Gazprom went out and hired the public accounting firm, PricewaterhouseCoopers, to write a report to say it was actually a good thing to steal these assets. In the end, there were more than 500 stories about the theft and graft at Gazprom. And then the most unusual, strange thing happened, which was that Vladimir Putin, who at this time had been president for about a year, and he was also effectively at war with the oligarchs because they were stealing power from him. And Vladimir Putin decided to step into the fray. And because the government owned a majority stake of Gazprom, he could use his government position to do something. And he decided to fire the CEO of Gazprom, the guy who's under whose command all these gas fields had been stolen. And he replaced him with a guy who was a friend of his, whose job it was not to steal assets of Gazprom. He could steal cash flow, just not assets. But just making the announcement that he wasn't going to steal assets, on that day, the share price of Gazprom jumped 138%. Following that, it doubled again after that, and doubled again, and so on and so forth. In the end, the price of Gazprom went up 100 times from when we started our campaign. And it became clear to me that I had discovered a new way to make money in Russia, which is basically to apply our anti-corruption campaigns to corrupt companies. Go in, buy shares of corrupt companies, research how they did the corruption, publish the research, name and shame the management, and hopefully create some political backdrop where the government then forces the company to clean up. And we did that quite successfully. In the bottom of the market, at the sort of depths of the crash, I had $100 million in my fund. 6 years later, my fund had grown to $4.5 billion, and I was the largest foreign investor in Russia.
It's really unbelievable. I mean, I'd consider it the trade of the century. What's so, I think, unusual about the story is where you started. You were down 90%. Most investors, when you're down that much, they tend to be very self-centered. They close the fund and maybe they raise a new fund to start anew. You decided, no, I'm going to stick it out. 90% down your fund was. You're going to stick it out and figure out a way to get whole. And obviously you did way more than that. But why did you decide to do that? Why were you so determined to see it through?
Prior to the crash, I had been traveling around the world, to Geneva, to London, to New York, telling everybody they should come and invest in Russia. They should come and invest in Russia with me. And I had a lot of people who accepted my invitation and invested with me, and then lost 90% of their money. And I was deeply ashamed, and I wanted to make them whole. And I didn't want to be the guy who, when things turned bad, just walked away. And so I had a big chip on my shoulder, which was to try to get them out of this hole that I'd gotten them into because I was ashamed of myself. And that was the motivation for sticking it out and the motivation for then fighting it out. Thankfully, it worked. It worked beautifully. And everybody got their money back, and they made money, and I made money, and everyone was happy. Of course, lots of other stuff happened since then, but at least that chapter of the story worked out well.
So before we move on to this next chapter and how it unfolds, just to take a step back here, Bill, you're clearly this brilliant man. You're a rock star investor. You were the best performing investor in the world at one point in time. But doing what you did in a country like Russia and thinking you just walk away unscathed, it either takes incredible guts or incredible naivete. I'm just curious, was it one or the other or a little bit of both?
A lot of both. I wouldn't call it naivete. So basically, the way I'm wired, to go to Russia in the first place, if you have all of your risk sensors up high, and those risk sensors then detect all sorts of risks, and you write down all the things that could happen to you in Russia, you wouldn't go. Nobody would go. And so in order for me to go, I basically had to sort of sand down those risk sensors. In other words, I could not make lists of all the terrible things that would happen, because if I did, it would prevent me from functioning. And so the way that I went about life was I kind of went out there and just, it's like when you go into a cold swimming pool, you just, jump in and hold your breath and see what happens. And that's kind of what I did with Russia. And then every day from that moment on, it was all just putting your finger on your nose and sucking up your gut and then jumping into the pool and just seeing what would happen. And so I didn't spend a lot of time obsessing about all the different terrible things that could have happened. And had I done that, I surely wouldn't have been there. And I probably should have done that based on what ended up happening. At the time, my worst case scenario was that I lose a bunch of money. And that's what I told my clients. I said, listen, you come and invest with me, you'll either lose all your money or you make 10 times your money. Probably one or the other, probably nothing in between. I never anticipated that the risks that could materialize would be so much greater than just money.
Well, let's get into that. So you're sitting there at one point in time, $4.5 billion in your fund. You're having all this success. And next thing you know, you shut down the fund, you liquidate all the assets, and you move yourself and most of your team to London. So what happened?
Just to give you a little bit of background. So after the Gazprom situation, we did this same thing at a whole bunch of other companies. We basically started going after corruption in all of the Russian all the big Russian state-owned companies. And for a while, I had this strange unspoken deal with Putin, it's not a real deal because I'd never spoken to him, never met him, but since we were both fighting with the same guys, the oligarchs, every time I would publicize a scandal, it was this expression: your enemy's enemy is your friend. I was going after his enemies, and so he would help me indirectly by stepping into these scandals and doing something about them. And so for about 4 years, I had the best job in the world, sort of fighting evil in Russia and making money at the same time. But then Putin eventually decided to win his war with the oligarchs. And the way he went about doing that was to arrest the richest oligarch in Russia, a man named Michael Khodorkovsky, the owner of an oil company called Yukos. He arrests Khodorkovsky. He puts him on trial, the richest man in Russia. The television cameras film the richest man in Russia sitting in a cage. And if you were the 17th richest man in Russia and you saw the richest guy in Russia sitting in a cage, what's your natural reaction going to be? You don't want to sit in that cage yourself. And so one by one, these guys went to Putin and they said, Vladimir, what do we have to do so we don't sit in a cage like Khodorkovsky? And Putin at this time, this was summer of 2004, he said very straightforward, very simple, 50%. And I'm not talking about 50% for the Russian government or 50% for the presidential administration of Russia. I'm talking about 50% for Vladimir Putin. At that moment in time, Putin became the richest man in the world, and all of my activities were no longer going against his enemies. They were going against his own personal economic interests, his 50% economic interest.
So you could see the writing on the wall at that point.
I actually didn't see the writing on the wall. If I had, I might have behaved differently. Remember, my risk sensors have all been sanded down. So I'm carrying on doing my exposés of Russian companies. But now I'm no longer doing it in a warm and friendly environment. I'm doing it in a hostile environment. And in retaliation for me doing this, on November 13th, 2005, I was flying back to Moscow, where I'd been living for 10 years. And I was stopped at the Sheremetyevo 2 airport in the VIP lounge. I was grabbed by 4 border guards, frog marched down to the airport detention center, locked up overnight, and then subsequently deported and declared a threat to national security. From that moment on, I was not allowed back into Russia. At this point, I realized that the only way that I was going to be able to protect my people was to evacuate them. So we did an emergency evacuation. And then I looked around and I said, what else could they get? And I thought, well, they could get my assets, the fund's assets. And so we liquidated all of our holdings in Russia, got all the money out, got our people out. And then I dusted off my hands and I said, phew, thank you very much, end of story. And it turned out not to be the end of a story, but the beginning of the worst nightmare you could ever imagine.
Well, let's get into that. One of your key advisors was someone named Sergei Magnitsky. Who was he and what role did he play here?
Sergei Magnitsky was one of my lawyers in Russia. He was, at the time, 35 years old, one of the smartest lawyers I knew in Russia. And what happened was, after I was expelled from Russia, about 18 months later, 25 police officers raided my office in Moscow, and 25 more police officers raided the office of an American law firm that I was using in Moscow. And they were specifically looking for the stamps, seals, and certificates for our investment holding companies, the companies through which we had invested all of our money in Russia. And all those documents were kept at our law firm. Now, the people who were looking for these, the police, didn't know that we had sold all of our assets. And so they took all those documents, and then the next thing we know, those documents had been used to fraudulently re-register our investment holding companies out of our name into the name of a man who had been convicted of manslaughter and let out of jail early by the police to put his name on these documents. So basically, the police, using the documents seized by them, had stolen our empty investment holding companies.
Wait, hang on. They actually stole your company.
They stole our investment holding companies, the fund's main investment vehicles into Russia.
I've never even heard of such a thing. They actually stole your business.
They stole my business. Thankfully, there was nothing in the business because we had liquidated everything.
It was just a shell at this point.
Well, so it was just a shell, and this was corporate identity theft organized by the police of the largest foreign investor in Russia. It's pretty astounding. But as I said, we got our money out before they could do anything to us, and so this was more of a legal issue than a financial issue. And I was worried that if the police are working with convicted killers to steal assets, what else could the police be doing? And so I didn't want to find myself walking through Frankfurt Airport one day and getting arrested. And that's why we hired Sergei Magnitsky in order to investigate this case and figure out why they were stealing our companies and what they were intending to do with them. And so Sergei gets involved. He conducts a very thorough investigation, and he comes to 2 important conclusions. The first conclusion was that they were trying to steal our assets, but they just weren't aware and couldn't get anything because our assets had already been transferred out into the West. However, what Sergei discovered was that their second objective, they did succeed in doing. And the second objective was when we had sold all of our securities. After I'd been kicked out, we sold all of our securities in Russia in 2006. And when we did that, we had a huge profit. We had $1 billion of profit. And on that $1 billion of profit, we paid a huge capital gains tax bill of $230 million to the Russian government. And what Sergei had discovered was that this group of gangsters and officials working together had taken our stolen companies, brought them back to the tax office, filed an amended tax return to say that the previous year's tax return was wrong, that these companies did not earn $1 billion. And they created some bogus contracts, which created some bogus costs equal to $1 billion. And so they said, okay, here's $1 billion of profits. And then they present all these bogus contracts to say, here's $1 billion of losses. $1 billion minus $1 billion equals zero. Therefore, they said to the tax office, to the tax authorities of Russia, we want the $230 million of taxes that were paid in the previous year refunded. It was the largest tax refund request in the history of Russia. They applied for it on the 23rd of December, 2007, 2 days before Christmas, and it was approved and paid out the next day, no questions asked. The largest tax refund in the history of Russia.
It's a crazy tale of corruption. No excuse, no defending anything they did. But by this point in time, you all had legitimately paid your taxes. You had already repatriated the assets. You're out of Russia. So why not let it go?
Well, because they had already charged one of my colleagues with a criminal offense. And in fact, they had actually at that point even charged me with a criminal offense. And so in order for us to defend ourselves against these false charges, we had to show why they were doing it. And they were doing it to cover up their crime. And so as a matter of legal defense, it was crucial that we prove what this was all about.
So when Sergei came up with this finding and came out and essentially, announced that this fraud had been committed, what did they do to him? How did they take that?
Well, one would think that they would have patted him on the back and given him a special medal of honor for saving Russia. This is not my money that was being stolen. It was Russian government money. But instead, they did nothing of the sort. The police officers he exposed came to his home on the morning of November 24th, 2008. They searched his house, and then they subsequently arrested him. They put him in pretrial detention, and they began to torture him to get him to withdraw his testimony. They put him in cells with 14 inmates and 8 beds and left the lights on 24 hours a day to impose sleep deprivation. They put him in cells with no heat and no window panes in December in Moscow, so he nearly froze to death. They put him in cells with no toilet, just a hole in the floor where the sewage would bubble up. They would move him from cell to cell to cell in the middle of the night. And they wanted to get him to withdraw his testimony, and they wanted to get him to sign a false confession to say that he stole the $230 million, and he did so on my instruction. And even though Sergei was just a tax lawyer, he wasn't a hardened criminal who knew how to survive in prison, for him, the idea of perjuring himself and bearing false witness was more painful than whatever the physical pain they were inflicting on him, and he refused to budge. And as a result, his situation got worse and worse. He ended up, after 6 months, getting sick. His stomach hurt terribly. He lost 40 pounds, and he was diagnosed as having pancreatitis and gallstones and needing an operation, which was scheduled for the 1st of August, 2009. About a week before the operation, they came to him again asked him to sign this false confession. Again, he refused. And in retaliation, they moved him to a different prison, a prison called Butyrka, which is considered to be one of the toughest prisons in Russia, maximum security. And most significantly for Sergei, at Butyrka, there was no medical facilities. At Butyrka, his health completely broke down. He went into constant agonizing, ear-piercing pain. He and his lawyers wrote 20 different desperate letters to every different branch of the Russian criminal justice system, begging for medical attention. Every one of their letters was either ignored or in some cases denied in writing. On the night of November 16, 2009, Sergei Magnitsky, his body could no longer tolerate it. He ended up going into critical condition on that night. The Butyrka authorities didn't want to have responsibility for him, and so they put him in an ambulance to a different prison that had a medical wing. But when he arrived at the different prison, instead of putting him in the emergency room, they put him in an isolation cell. They chained him to a bed, and 8 riot guards with rubber batons beat Sergei Magnitsky to death. That was November 16th, 2009, Sergei Magnitsky was 37 years old. He left a wife and 2 children.
It's a tragedy so hard to even fathom that if I wrote a script about it, you'd say, forget it. There's no way the audience could suspend disbelief like that. Unbelievable. Well, you would then spend years and years of your life lobbying Congress to do something to expose all of this corruption that was behind the killing of your friend, and I'm sure so many others. Eventually, it culminated in something called the Magnitsky Act. It's an incredible piece of legislation. What exactly is it? What does it accomplish?
Well, so the Magnitsky Act was my reaction to this whole thing. When Sergei Magnitsky was killed, I made a vow to his memory, to his family, and to myself that I was going to put aside my other activities and seek justice for Sergei Magnitsky and make sure the people who killed him pay a very dear price. And for the last 8 years, I've put aside my business. I no longer manage money, and I've been on a campaign to get justice. And we came up with this idea, which is that the people who killed Sergei didn't kill him for ideology or religion. They killed him for money. They killed him for $230 million. And that money, they don't feel comfortable keeping in Russia because that money, as easily as they stole it, it can be stolen from them. They keep it in the West. And we've all seen them running around New York and Geneva and London and various other places. And so we came up with this idea, which is that we may not have jurisdiction over torturers and murderers from Russia in the West, but we definitely do have jurisdiction for whether they come and visit our countries or whether they use our banking systems. And so I went to Washington and I took this idea and I met with Senator Benjamin Cardin, a Democrat from Maryland, Senator John McCain, Republican from Arizona, and I said, let's ban the visas and freeze the assets of the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky and the people who do similar types of terrible things in Russia. And that was the genesis for the Magnitsky Act. The Magnitsky Act was passed in December 2012 under Obama, and there are now 49 people on the Magnitsky list who are involved in either Sergei's false arrest, torture, and death, or of other similar atrocities. And the Magnitsky Act has become a movement. It's become a worldwide movement now. There are now 5 countries that have Magnitsky Acts. Canada was another one, United Kingdom, Estonia, Lithuania, Ukraine is now considering it, South Africa is considering it, even the little country of Gibraltar off Spain is now considering a Magnitsky Act. And this has effectively become the modern day technology for dealing with human rights abusers and corrupt officials. This is the tool that works in the 21st century. And so this has been an ongoing campaign. I'm nowhere near done. It's taken up 8 years of my life and probably take up a lot more than 8 years going forward.
It's ironic that you've become this accidental activist. It's a far cry from this former life of an investor. You've essentially become the living embodiment of the very person you were essentially rebelling against once upon a time, if you go back to your childhood. So how does this life, the last 8 years, and God knows how many years going forward, how does this compare to the former one as an investor?
Well, I loved my life as an investor. I loved the intellectual challenges. I liked the way that you can measure your successes. It was all very fun and interesting, challenging, and exciting. But I have to say that fighting for money, which is effectively what I was doing for the last 25 years of my life, is not nearly as gratifying as fighting for justice. I find my mission, the mission that I'm on right now for Sergei Magnitsky and many others, is infinitely more gratifying to get justice than it is getting money. Now, of course, I couldn't have done I couldn't have ever been as successful as an activist if I hadn't made the money first. But I have no intention of going back to business in the future because I found my true calling, which is what I'm doing right now as a full-time human rights activist.
Well, not to get too philosophical, but now that you bring up your true calling, do you ever feel like this is really somehow where you were meant to end up, using your passion and your tenacity and your intellect to champion global human rights causes, that everything else was sort of a means to an end?
Well, I'm not particularly religious. I think this is just a random series of events and challenges, which has brought me to where I am today. I don't think that this was preordained, but But I'm glad I'm here, and a lot of other people are glad that I'm here because I'm bringing a highly analytical, highly effective, business-oriented approach to a field that doesn't have a lot of highly analytical, highly goal-oriented people like myself, and we're having big success, and that success is to the benefit of many, many people around the world. The Magnitsky Act has now been globalized. Victims of human rights abuse in any country can use it, and just a couple weeks ago, the U.S. government sanctioned 13 of the most heinous human rights abusers from all over the world, from different countries, under the global Magnitsky Act. The Canadians have done a similar thing. And we've now effectively broken new ground in how bad guys can be treated. And they're no longer feeling all that comfortable because even if they haven't yet been sanctioned, every bad guy knows that their assets could be frozen anywhere in the world by a number of countries for being bad. And that creates a whole new set of incentives for bad guys, and it creates a whole new set of punishments as well.
Well, you've done it. And you created the law, or you were certainly a big force behind the creation of the law, not just here, but it sounds like more and more countries adopting it all over the world. So I guess what's left? What's left to accomplish on this mission of yours?
Well, a lot. I've only got 5 countries. There's about 185 to go. I want this to be a global standard, and I want it to be a global standard that becomes a standard that's implemented, in a pedestrian fashion, so that bad guys know that basically if you're a bad guy and people know about it, you're going to end up having your assets frozen. It's just going to be a matter of course. And I want this to be not just a sort of symbolic thing, but a highly implemented thing that happens a lot of places to a lot of people. That's my goal, and I've got a long way to go before I get there.
Well, I can't imagine Putin and the other oligarchs and government officials are too crazy about what you're doing here. I have to imagine, given their history, that you're somewhat of a marked man. Do you constantly live in fear? I mean, how do you just go about your daily life knowing that you're probably on their most hated list and will be, for many years to come?
Well, they've made death threats, kidnapping threats. They're trying to extradite me, arrest me, sue me. They're doing everything. But I don't live in fear. They should actually be more fearful of me, not in terms of any physical danger, but they should be fearful of me because we're coming to get them and their money and want to take away all the benefits of their crimes. And we're coming to get them, and they know it.
So maybe in a way, almost going public with this helps protect you to some degree.
Surely. If anything happens to me, you know exactly who did it.
Bill, the name of this podcast is called The Art of Excellence. What's your definition of excellence?
In my own life, what I've seen is that all success is 5% inspiration, 95% perspiration, and it's all about if you really want to succeed in any particular endeavor, whether it be, in my case, fund management or political activism, it's all about rolling up your sleeves and constantly putting the time in and constantly course correcting and constantly working on bettering yourself at every step of the way.
It's a great answer. Bill, I admired the heck out of you as an investor, and I admire you even more as a political activist. Thank you for what you've done. Thank you for what you're continuing to do. I'm not very religious myself, but if somehow Sergei in some way is looking down from wherever, I think he'd be very proud at what you've done in his name.
Well, I would hope that he feels like his contribution, his sacrifice in the world had some meaning.
Bill, thanks for being on the show. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. You can subscribe to the show at iTunes, Stitcher, and theartofexcellence.com. I've got one small favor to ask. If you like the show, please take a minute and leave us a review on iTunes. I would really appreciate that. I'll see you next time.